All right, welcome everyone. My name is Mike DeGoyer. I'm glad to be with you today. We'll be talking about implementing Zero Trust at Microsoft. By introduction, I'm working for the Digital Security and Risk Engineering team here at Microsoft, and we're responsible for the policies and implementation of security. Joining me will be Zach Edwards, one of our senior engineers here at Microsoft from our identity team, who's also working on conditional access as well as many projects here at Microsoft. So with that, I'm excited to get started and to share with you some content today on what we're doing here at Microsoft to implement Zero Trust. One of the first things I want to talk about is what we're going to learn today. So I love this picture because if you look at this bridge, in your right mind, you would think to yourself, would I want to build that bridge? You notice there's some water going underneath there. It looks a little dangerous. It looks like, man, what could happen if I step on that bridge? Today, I want to ease your mind and talk about how we approached conditional access using the reporting features from Azure and integrating that into how you can successfully implement the policies. I want to talk about our is managed scenario and how that translates to is healthy, because really it's a three-step process that we've gone through. Then we're going to actually show you and dive a little deeper into how we use that remote reporting mode and how we use that data and how we've actually driven that to change our approach, because as we've gone through this conditional access process, we've actually modified our approach as we go. And it's been a great learning lesson for us as we move along. We're going to show you a lot of demos today. I know this isn't going to be slide heavy, so hopefully we can move forward and show you guys really the nuts and bolts of how we're configuring this here at Microsoft. And we're also going to talk about guest multi-factor authentication in terms of how we manage these accounts across all the people. So with that, let's get started. I want to set the premise a little for you in terms of how Microsoft looks at this. We kind of have this stool, if you will, and some of you might have heard this before, but essentially we kind of think of risk management in those four pillars of device health, identity management, data telemetry, information protection. And really, if any pieces of those stool fall, then essentially your risk profile and your security posture is changed dramatically. And so what we've done is actually a couple things key to implementing this policy. If you think about CorpNet, as you will, the corporate network, we are moving away from that design as a whole. And actually the COVID response has actually prompted us to go even faster to where everyone is assumed they're working from the internet. And so that internet first experience is really where we're headed. This allows us to really reduce the risk in terms of where we're looking and how we're managing devices. And we look at how we're using our telemetry across those devices and services for what people are accessing for. I want to get into our conditional access strategy for a second. We've been on a journey here, and our first was really we went after strong authentication. In strong authentication really drove us to where we basically set up the services where people were using multi-factor authentication, changing away for using biometrics, etc. We've had a long journey and several steps in that process. To get people on board, then we looked at a project called Secure Mail. Now what Secure Mail was, essentially it just drove people of real simple. If you need access to email, then you're going to have to be managed and you're going to have to use multi-factor authentication. So pretty straightforward from how we're using a carrot, as you will, for have people moving forward. And then we're into the third phase here of conditional access. And conditional access is really about driving the management, driving the health requirements across each platform. As you'll notice, we have similar security controls across all our platforms, whether it be Android, iOS, Mac, or Windows. But each one of them are in a little different state because we're on this journey. We started to go with mobile first. And we've been in the mobile area for probably a couple of years where access is a prerequisite of having access to email, or enrollment or management, I should say, is a preemptive requirement for having access to email. If you think about our other platforms, Mac and Windows, we're going to deep dive into Windows, but we have been on a journey with those, and we continue to push the boundaries of those, each one of those platforms. But really the key is, when you're looking at conditional access for your enterprise, you can't use the broad brush approach. You really need to have the individualized per platform view so you can start to drive those requirements, because each one of them are very different. The encryption scenario on Mac, for example, very different than what Windows. Using BitLocker, for example, on Windows, very different than File Vault. The escrowing of keys and management of those keys and requiring those conditional access health pieces. Really, you have to look at each one of those and then decide how to integrate those for your enterprise. I want to take a step now, and we're going to deep dive into conditional access, and then we'll get into some demos here pretty soon. But I want to set the table for where are we going at Microsoft. 2 years ago, we started going down this journey, and really the journey is, if you think about it, we are embracing virtual desktop and Azure. As a result, we're moving a lot of our external staff to using Windows Virtual Desktop as their primary access scenario. We have it available to employees. So if anyone is literally on vacation, sitting in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and they need to get access to something, but they don't want to really manage that device, they have an opportunity to do that using Windows Virtual Desktop. We've embraced the Azure scenario in terms of all of our new devices are coming through autopilot. And so by default, all of our devices are actually going through that Azure domain join scenario. We actually don't want people to join our domain anymore unless there's something like a high value asset or some on-prem dependency. But as a default, all of our devices are actually moving to Azure. We've also worked through the workplace join scenario, which is essentially driving consistency, because people still want the BYOD scenario. They want to enroll their own device, but we want them to have that choice. But along with that choice, we've had to look at things like revising the terms of use so that they're consistent across the globe and across policy and across the company, so that users have an expectation of how we would manage that device, whether it be a telemetry, whether it be a response, whether it be by policy. And so for workplace join, we look for that consistency across each platform. And last, we have the domain scenario, which, to be honest, we're moving away from. And so as machines age out, those are actually going away. But we do have parity with our MDM policies, and then we're just tracking which ones will migrate faster as we migrate the entire company toward Azure and toward the Windows Virtual Desktop scenarios. Think about it in these three buckets, and this is how we do. Unmanaged vendor, virtual desktop. Azure is going to be your corporate device. Workplace join, obviously for your personal device, which gives you the flexibility of consistent policies and everything, but a little more control as to what you're doing for that device. I want to talk about conditional access in our approach here. We really have a three-tiered approach. Essentially, it goes in 1, 2, 3. The first is the reporting phase, and we're going to show you how we do that and what we did. But the reporting is so significant. If you look at how we were enabling conditional access before this capability was available, we were actually going as an organizational by ring, by wave, very typical enterprise kind of release approach. Once we had that reporting capability from Azure in our hands, we actually are taking a full data-driven approach, and we consistently revise that approach based upon that reporting and that to drive a data-driven phased approach. Once we have that reporting, we've made some decisions, and this is our decision early on, is we are going in a two-step process, which is an is managed, which is pretty straightforward. Your device must be managed in order to access something like Office 365 or line of business applications, etc. And then the second is healthy. And we did it that way because the health requirements tend to be a lot more specific. Let's say secure logon, for example. It is one of our health requirements, but some of those devices out there have an older TPM chip, but they might have to still develop on them and might still be in use. Do we want to just block those because of health? You know, that's a financial decision. That's also a risk decision. That is something that each organization should look at. And when you do this, you should really look at each one of those. You can look at your boot scenario and the risk of secure boot. Look at your logon scenarios. Are you using biometrics? Are you using hello? Are you using PIN? Are you using password? Look across all your platforms to be consistent. Look at the data encryption. Is the data protected? Most important. And then do you have different configuration settings or a minimum operating system or an OS update scenario or service that you're actually pushing these to require? And then finally, from a health perspective, how are you getting the telemetry to manage these? Because it's great if you have all these health requirements, but if you don't have the telemetry to actually go and from a forensics scenario, go actually investigate and look at what's going on in the device, you're kind of missing half the picture. And so that telemetry and monitoring is super important across all platforms, whatever condition that comes from. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Zach Edwards, who's going to run us through two policy configurations. The first is Zach's going to walk through read-only and how we used that and how we configure that. The second is he's going to walk through the is managed scenario. Is managed for us is a domain join or managed, and so we leveraged both Intune and Azure, the compliance policy there, but we also leverage is joined. And so Zach is going to run us through those, and I'll turn the time over to him.
Thanks, Mike. Let's talk more about conditional access report-only policies. These policies are evaluated at sign-in just like every other Azure AD conditional access policy, but the key difference is that the policy doesn't actually go live. It just allows you to collect telemetry based on what the policy will be enforcing before enforcing the policy. When you're deploying at a large scale, this is super valuable because it's really hard to know beforehand every kind of device, app, and use case that's happening inside your tenant. So we always start with the report-only policy. And let me show you the one we just built here. Typically with report-only policies, we denote that in the beginning of the policy title. So this policy is report-only, targeting all users, all apps, coming from a Windows operating system. Lastly, the control we're enforcing is device compliance. So let's look at how that policy actually looks. We're targeting all users. We usually keep one break glass account. That account is a strongly secured account. It's got MFA applied to it with a physical MFA token, like a FIDO key, and we keep that stored in a locked physical safe box on campus, probably in my manager's office. Now, we're targeting all applications here. This is literally every service principal in your tenant. You can also say select applications. So it's both valuable for the inclusion and exclusion rules if you wanted to do select applications. You may want to start with just targeting Office 365 applications in your initial rollouts, or maybe build different policies targeting O365 versus policies targeting line of business apps or apps secured through Azure AD App Proxy. Likewise, super valuable to have the same level of control with the exclusion, but for this demo, let's just do all cloud apps. And for conditions, there's a lot of conditions that you can choose from. You can play off the Azure AD identity protection, sign-in user risks. You can use device platform, which is what we're doing here. We're saying this policy is applying to the Windows OS. Name locations is also super valuable. That allows you to create a name location set based off IPv4, IPv6 addresses. So if you have a set of addresses that are specific to your company's network, then you can build policies saying, I want to act differently when it's coming from a corporate network when we recognize these IP addresses. In this case, we're just going to use the device platform condition. Lastly, the access controls is what actually is enforced when these conditions are met. So in this case, we want to say the device needs to be marked as compliant, or we'll allow the device to be hybrid Azure AD joined. Now what's important down here is for multiple controls is that if you select one of the selected controls, then it's acting as an OR statement versus all the selected controls is more of an AND statement. So select that and make sure it's in report only mode. Save it. Now that that's done, let's show you how we can kind of look at the analytics for this. So in the Azure AD portal, if you scroll down past security to workbooks, you'll find these default workbooks. You can build workbooks on your own. There's a great set already there by default. I like the conditional access insights and reporting one. That's the first one under conditional access right now. By default, it's going to load all enabled policies for conditional access, show you some great graphs and some awesome views that you don't have to build yourself. And that's really valuable. And furthermore, if you come up with a view that you really like, create your own workbook, you save it, you can refresh it every day without having to rewrite the policy queries to do those. So here, you'll notice that when you're filtering by conditional access policy, the report-only policies are separated at the bottom. So let's look at the Windows OS required device compliance policy I just built. Now, obviously, I just built this policy, so we have a very small amount of traffic happening in this tenant. This is one of our site tenants, so it's going to be harder to show the real data here, but it will still give you an idea of the tools you can use to deploy this in your company. So looking at the report-only policy, you can see so far we've had 23 users in the last probably 15 minutes sign in with an unmanaged device. You can drill further into this by clicking on these log analytic icons. If you don't have log analytics deployed for your tenant, highly recommend it. You can do that on the logs in the diagnostic settings here. That allows you to write Kusto queries targeting your sign-in logs, and you can use Kusto to write really in-depth queries to get a better idea of what's happening. It allows you to continue drilling down to whatever level you need to go to. Workbooks are super awesome, but if you need more in-depth information about a single user sign-on, perhaps for troubleshooting or just a better analysis, I usually go to the sign-in logs, found under monitoring here on the left. This is your normal sign-in view for all users in your tenant. However, if you click on an individual sign-in event, you'll notice there's a conditional access and a report-only mode that shows up in this details tab. So let's look at report-only. In this case, this was a report-only failure, which means had we turned on this policy, this user would not be able to access. They would receive the message that says you can't get there from here. You need to enroll your device or become Intune compliant. So this is really important because if you need to know, hey, maybe a VP or an executive is going to be impacted by this policy, we can understand why and how beforehand and then make steps to mitigate that so on the day of policy going live, there's no impact to these users. So now that we've built our Windows OS required device compliance policy in a report-only state, let's look at the Intune side of things and how we can further configure what a compliance device means in our organization. As we talked about earlier, secure boot's important for us as an example, and we can enforce that with Intune. So I'm going to open up endpoint.microsoft.com, which takes you to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. From here, you can go into the devices, go to device compliance policies, and we can create a new policy. If you had policies already, you'd see them here, but let's create one together. We're going to target the Windows 10 platform to align with our earlier created CA policy. We'll name this one Ignite Test Win 10. Here on the compliance settings is where all most of the controls are, rather. So you have secure boot, you have BitLocker. You can say, hey, I need my device to have a minimum operating system. I want it to have a PIN or a password to unlock. The password must have X amount of characters. This is great for iPhone and Android. Maybe the default iPhone PIN is 4 characters. You want to lengthen it to 6 for a more secure experience. These devices are connecting to your organization. You take the controls on how secure you want them to be in order to meet compliance, and that translates into a conditional access fail or conditional access pass. So I'm going to leave most of these by default. Let's turn on a few of these: BitLocker, Secure Boot, and we all want a password. We'll leave the device password settings at a default. I highly recommend looking through all of these. There's a lot of options here, definitely too many to go over in this demo. So we'll go to the next tab. What happens if the compliance settings aren't met? Well, you want to mark your device non-compliant. Do you want to do that immediately? Do you want to do that, maybe give them a 24-hour window to mitigate the issue? In our case, we're going to leave it at the immediate state. Now, here we're going to assign it to all users. I recommend doing it to all users. You can build different policies. Again, if you wanted to roll out in smaller groups. For this demo, we're going to do all users. Again, just like conditional access, you have the ability to exclude groups. When you do exclusion and inclusion rules, I recommend always using groups versus individual users. This makes it a lot easier to manage, a lot easier to report up to your management on how effective the policies are and what number of users, percentage of users are impacted and enforced through the policies. Finally, you review the policy. Everything looks good. We go ahead and create it. And just like that, now we've further controlled our conditional access by saying what is a compliant device versus what is not a compliant device.
Moving on, I wanted to talk about device health. I mentioned it a little, but let's go through some of the specifics before we go into the actual configuration, because I think it's super important to look at each one of these for your enterprise, whether it be secure logon, whether it be boot, whether it be response. There's some key lessons learned that we've had in here that I just wanted to touch on before we actually go through the demo and actually show you how we configured it. The first is secure logon, and I won't drain this, but I do want to go through a couple of these. I can't tell you the number of escalations we get from users that say, hey, you reset my PIN and suddenly you reset my device. Now, at Microsoft, we don't reset devices, but a number of people, because your device is managed, assume that you as the enterprise reset that device. When in the reality, it's their 6-year-old who's sitting there playing with their phone or something and hit the retry. Now, with the changes from Apple, with the changes from Android, these things don't really happen anymore. This is from a couple of years ago, but I want to bring this up because from a consistency, from a user perspective, you really want to drive that consistency in logon experience. The other one I want to touch base on is response, because to me this comes down to a trust. Do your employees trust you? Trust is something you earn from your employees, and so there's something you have to spell out to them and be open and tell them what is going on, because when users look at a policy, there's a technical capability and then there's a policy. And you run on this on Android, you'll run it in Defender ATP, you'll run it in a lot of security controls that you implement across your enterprise. Users will say, hey, you've implemented X policy and are running X software on my device, like ATP, which ATP can gather information on all these things that a user is doing. Now, you have to gain the trust, and more important, you have to have the internal policies that tell a user, this is what we do and don't do with your data, for example. You also have to have something like that when it comes to a defined policy when it comes to encryption. So if I'm on a BYOD device and I'm encrypting the key, I want to be clear that if I unenroll that device, I have the ability to grab that key and protect that data. It's not I enrolled and now Microsoft suddenly would own my data internally. And so we also spend a lot of time with users, educating them and helping them understand, here's exactly how we're going to work with your encryption key, for example. Here's where it's going to be available. Here's how we would recover it, or here's how we'd help you, or here's how the policy would work on the device. So all of these things are super, super important. But we are going to actually go through and actually show you how we actually do a little bit of configuration. There's two scenarios that we wanted to go through, and we'll also go through exception management. The reason we're going to go through exception management here is because once you've configured an is healthy configuration, so for example, in our scenario, we have it configured for Office 365. However, what happens for us, and this would go with any application. What about the team that's developing the application that you actually put the security control in place for? How are you going to handle them? Because they have to develop on the application, but yet you're enforcing for the application. Well, you can't have it both ways a lot of times. And so what we also want to do is go in and show you how we manage the exception and group management for certain things like that. That is super helpful. And Zach is going to walk us through kind of the architecture of our thought process for how we look at group management as a whole, and kind of some of the tips and tricks that we use for managing this inside Microsoft. And with that, I'll turn it over to Zach.
Let's talk about securing guest access inside your tenant. At Microsoft, we know how important business-to-business collaboration is, but as an IT admin, it's our jobs to make sure that that's happening safely and securely. The best way to do that is with a conditional access policy. So let's build a guest user policy to require MFA for our guest users. So, under conditional access, we'll select new policy. I have the policy name on my clipboard. All guest users, all apps, all devices require MFA. This is a naming schema that works well for us, but it's up to you and your team to find a naming convention that works well for you. For users and groups, simply select all guests and external users for the inclusion set. For the exclusion set, there may be times where you need to provide an exception, be it short-term or long-term. I highly recommend using Azure AD groups to provide exceptions. It does not scale well to provide individual user exceptions to a conditional access policy. Furthermore, if you have multiple policies that you need to exclude the same set of users from, you can use a group to create that same exclusion parity across the policies. For cloud apps or actions, I'm going to select all cloud apps. Again, you can include and exclude individual apps as you choose. For this demo, it's all apps. For conditions, I'm not going to select any conditions. I want every guest user, no matter how they're signing in, what protocol they're coming through, or what location they're coming from, I want them to have to complete MFA. So that's why I'm leaving conditions blank here. Under Grant, we'll select Require Multi-Factor Authentication. As simple as that. Next time a guest user signs in, has not already registered for MFA in your tenant, they'll be walked through the very intuitive Azure Multi-Factor Authentication registration process. It will say on their next sign-in, additional verification required, and they'll be walked through to complete registration using the Microsoft Authenticator app, using an SMS or phone call, or a FIDO key perhaps. And as a tenant admin, you can control which kind of authentication methods you allow inside your tenant. So we'll go ahead and select this and proceed with creating the policy in a report-only state. Now, by default, if you don't have any other guest MFA policies, the guest won't be prompted to register, so they will show as report-only failures. But as you continue to roll out the guest MFA policy, you'll set it from report only to on, and you can build the groups incrementally. I hope you enjoyed this demo. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it. Zach's a great engineer. We really appreciate everything he does here at us for Microsoft. I want to walk us through the summary of kind of what we've gone through today. A couple things. I first want to start and just have some reminders for you about reporting mode. Something that we've done internally here is we use this for all our policies. Any Azure-based conditional access policies, we are now using this as a default. And so if you think about it operationally, I highly encourage you to look at using that wherever you can, and then build those processes to be agile and adjust. I mentioned earlier in the conversation that if you looked at our approach for conditional access, it has changed significantly. You know, we started with an org-based rollout, very standard like any other enterprise does. Then we moved to a telemetry-based, and we used our reporting-only mode. We actually grabbed people that were compliant for our policy. We enabled them. And then, you know, because of the amount of data that our Azure service stores for the size of an enterprise that we are, we actually split back. We took a break. We did a couple organizations to just prove a couple theories. And actually now we're back in running in compliant mode, meaning enable the policy for people that are compliant. And so don't be afraid to iterate on your implementation of health requirements using this super effective and highly valuable tool that the Azure team has provided. It really helps you to limit the disruption. It really helps you to hit the nail and not kind of give a misguided message to both your leadership, to your users, and it makes things just simple for everyone around you. So highly encourage you to look at using reporting only mode and have that as your default. We did review the is managed scenario. With that, I would say go and look at your risk profile. Like if you look at our risk profile, for example, our domain joined machines, those policies have been required, are a lot of our health requirements for many, many years. And so if you actually look at it at a risk perspective, our domain join scenario is actually very secure. And so that's one of the reasons why we went with an is managed scenario, is because we have confidence in both our system center configuration manager that's managing about 300,000 clients. We have confidence in our Intune scenario where we're managing another 60, 70,000 devices and we're adding 10,000 plus per month. And so we have confidence that as I mentioned, we're shifting from domain joined to Intune. As we move that needle, we can actually move within the construct of is managed is healthy. When you're looking at is healthy, just a couple things. Look at the risk value of where you're going. And essentially, we talked about configuring that read-only policy, but really for each individual health policy that you're enabling, you need to use that read-only policy. For encryption, for example, put it on today. Go look at the encryption policy and see who's out there. Then grab the make and model and start to look at those by TPM and what they have supported to know if you're going to have a large hardware issue. And then get that into your budget. If you have to buy in a lot of hardware next year, I'm sure that's something a lot of people would want to know, that suddenly you look at encryption as a health indicator and 20% of your devices actually can't be encrypted. Like, you need to actually look at all that stuff. And the reporting, most important, can help you figure that out for each one of those health scenarios. And then managing exceptions or groups. Just a couple tidbits that we've learned is you must have that process defined as to who's going to own approval and who's going to own the follow-up and setting expectations, because the reality is once you set something or you give people even a minor approval for, say, 30 days, 60 days, people tend to forget, or I think it's just the convenience factor. Once it works, it works. They go back, they go away, they forget, oh, that's right, I had to have an exception for this because my device doesn't speak X policy, or it doesn't work with X because I'm using a beta OS or something like that. Or there's a number of factors that you have to get into this, but definitely set expectations and build that as a process into your operations. Hopefully through these demos, you've learned a little, you've been able to glean some insight for how we do things here at Microsoft. Hopefully the bridge on your right is something that looks like something you'd walk down, something you'd have confidence in. And hopefully this presentation has given you a little bit of confidence that you can understand how Microsoft has done things internally here and how you can leverage those tools to actually successfully implement that for your business. I do want to kind of go through a what if scenario. I love camping personally. And I love this picture because it reminds me that sometimes even the best plans have you out in the wilderness, literally in your tent with pouring rain. But there's always a light. And so you need to have a plan for certain scenarios that are going to come up. And here's some of the scenarios that came up with us. The reality is you may have some users that just from a health requirements, whether it's a device, whether it's a development, for software, whether it's hardware, there might be scenarios that you don't have a solution. And so you need to account for that. Just assume you may run into a couple things there. You may run into issues with development because development circles may have to run a different version of software, hardware, whatever it may be. You may have beta OS compatibility issues, either frontward or backward. People running a beta version of a Mac, for example, running Big Sur, that maybe doesn't support the latest encryption bits from your MDM. Or you may have it the opposite way. Maybe they're running a legacy to where they're past your OS standards, but yet some of those OS standards are so old that they don't even support some of the criteria or some of the security requirements you have for a certain OS version. So account for these. And more important, have a decision matrix. This is so important. You need to know when you would disable a policy. The worst thing you could do is start to implement something like conditional access and not have a decision tree, a defined direction for who would own that decision. And so put that in place. Even if you put it in writing and the line has to move, the line moves. It doesn't matter. Just put something down and put it in writing and let your users know, look, if you need an exception, go talk to your manager, go talk to your skip level, go talk to your vice president. It doesn't matter. Have something so that users have some guidance. And the last thing I'd say is understand when you would use the big red button. I use that term because when we first started implementing conditional access a couple of years ago, the question always came up, hey, when you have this fully implemented and suddenly, here at Microsoft, for example, I'll take iOS, for example, or actually I'll use Windows since we demoed Windows today. Windows, we have 350,000 devices under management here in Microsoft internally. What happens if something gets rolled out and all 350,000 of those people get blocked? What do? You need to have an answer for that. When would you actually turn off the policy for a platform, for example? And I don't think it needs to be that drastic for turning off all policies. And this goes back to your reporting and telemetry. When would you turn off for encryption, for example? When would you turn off for minimum OS? When would you turn off for secure boot? When would you? So have these things in your pocket and understand that developing that criteria is super important from a business perspective, not just technically. I think it's pretty straightforward on how you would configure or not, but have that criteria in place so that you can really run this as a service. Because really when it comes down to it, conditional access and implementing conditional access needs to be a service consideration. In your organization, you need to identify the individual who's going to own this, and whether it be quarterly, monthly, whatever, they need to run this as a service. And that will help you go a long way. With that, I thank you for your time. I appreciate being able to present to you today, and have a great day.